Okay, our first participant, Frank Quintero Jr., is a constitutional specialist. He is the main partner in Quintero Broche law firm in Coral Gables. He is a graduate of the University of Illinois Chicago School of Law. He's a member of the Illinois Bar since 1983, the Florida Bar since 1984. He's participated and has had hundreds and thousands of cases in the United States Supreme Court, the United States Courts of Appeal, especially in the 11th Circuit, the 4th Circuit, and second one, among district courts throughout the United States. He belongs to the main organizations, clubs, and associations of attorneys throughout the United States. He just received an award against all odds from the Florida Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And without further ado, we'd like to hand things over to our first participant, who's going to talk to us about the Cuban legal system and the possible future reconstruction of the legal system in Cuba, Frank Quintero Jr.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Ariel. I want to thank Dr. Bustamante and Vice President Ariel Ramos for this invitation, and of course the Cuban Cultural Heritage Foundation for asking me to be here with everyone today. When I was asked to do this and prepare this talk was originally designed to occur tomorrow in the afternoon. And when I submitted the presentation and Dr. Bustamante saw it and presented it to the members of the board, they felt that this particular topic was so important that it should be the first topic that is discussed in this symposium, because everything that will emanate into a future democratic Cuba will start with a constitution and a judicial system. And it's funny because it brought back some memories when I was in my first year of law school. One of my property professors by the name of Art Scheller, who was a great professor, we were all first-year law students, and he asked a question. And he said, which of the basic rights forms the basis of a democracy? And everybody started raising their hands, to answer the questions. Some said free speech, others said due process, others said the presumption of innocence. And he kept saying nope, and nope, and nope, and no one got the right answer. And he said, the basis of a democracy is the right of the people to own property. Think about that. The right of an individual to own his or her own property really is the basis of every democracy, where the government cannot take property away from people, where the government doesn't own the property. And so that statement stuck with me for my entire career, and when I was asked to prepare this talk, that came back to my mind, and I share it with all of you. Now, in order to get to a possible future of Cuba, we have to take a walk. And we have to take a walk into the past to bring us to the present in order to take us into the future. Why? Well, because we've learned so much over the last 115 years. And I use the term 115 years because in 1917 was the Soviet Revolution. And as we know, Cuba and many other countries adopted a Soviet-style system of government and economy. And so what have we learned over the last 15 years? Something that the Soviets and the Chinese learned, that while they have a totalitarian system of government, their economic system has evolved into a capitalist open market economy. So they are, at this point, not transitioning into a Western democracy, but understanding that open markets, the right to own property, the right to do with your property whatever you wish, free from government intervention, is what is allowing those socialist countries to economically be successful. And we've learned that. The only people that haven't learned that are the Cubans in Cuba. And I don't know, how many times you have to explain that, and I don't know what you have to do not to understand that concept, but that concept is there. It's been proven to be true, and it is actually in effect as we sit here today. But anyway, go to page 2, please. The outline of what we're going to be going over today is we're going to talk about a brief history of the Cuban constitutions. We're going to talk about the current Cuban Constitution, which I hadn't seen or read until I was asked to review or prepare this talk. We're going to talk about the history and the development of the U.S. Constitution. Most people think that the U.S. Constitution was something that they sat down and wrote in a day or two or a week or a month after the Revolutionary War ended in 1779. And that is not the case. Actually, the history of the Constitution is something that we as Americans and our government sometimes forgets. We go into a country to liberate them. We expect that the country is going to go from one day to the next into a democracy, and we forget our own history, which we're going to go over today, and you'll see the development and the evolution of everything that happened between 1776 and 1789, when our Constitution was actually signed. We're going to talk about the formulation of governments, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. And then we're going to talk about what could work for Cuba in the future. Because we in the United States really have two systems, or actually there's 51 different judicial systems in place. And you'll see the difference between the two types of systems, one that is incorporated into the states and the other one that is used by the federal government. And that's very important. Now, before we begin, we need to understand some things, because if Cuba is going to evolve and Cuba is going to develop a Western democratic system of government, constitution, and an open market economic system, that decision will be from the people inside Cuba. It will not be from us. We can advise, we can recommend, we can counsel, we can give our expertise, having lived in the United States or in Western Europe or in any other Western democratic country. But in the end, it will be the people inside Cuba, once they have the opportunity to have a free and fair election or free and fair decision-making process of which route they want to go. If they want to continue with the Marxist, socialist, Leninist form of totalitarian government, a closed market or controlled market economic system, and continue to struggle and continue to starve and continue to be hurt politically and economically, or do they want to change? And do they want to join the Western democracies? Do they want to have an open market so that not only the individuals inside Cuba will flourish, but the nation will flourish as a whole and join the rest of the Western democracies and hopefully return to the success that Cuba had prior to the 1959 revolution. So, with that, one more thing, very, very important. Judicial systems are affected by the population, the number of people in a country. And this is a fact that we must, and they must, keep in mind. Cuba has 11 million, approximately 11 million people living in the country today. A little over 11 million. Florida has 22 million people living in the state of Florida, and the United States has 335 million people in the United States. Why is that important? Well, what may work in the United States as a federal judicial system may not necessarily work in Cuba. What may work in Florida with its 22 million people, 67 counties, may not necessarily work in Cuba. And we're going to see what, in my opinion, would probably work in Cuba. And one more thing. The opinions I'm expressing today are my opinions. They are not necessarily the opinions of the foundation. If the foundation wants to adopt my opinions, I would be very proud and very humbled. But these are my opinions, my review, and my research on all these issues within this topic. Okay? If you go to page 3, please. All right. In order, as we already know, in order for a democratic government to survive, it must have a constitution. And that constitution must contain a Bill of Rights, that will protect not only the people, but the different branches of government and prevent dictatorships, totalitarian control, or other forms of dictatorships or other forms of control over the government and the people. But no matter what, rights are placed into a constitution if the elected government does not protect, preserve, and enforce those rights for everyone, then the Constitution is not worth the paper it's written on. And you're going to see that later on in this talk with the current Cuban Constitution. Cuba's last pre-revolutionary constitution was the 1940 Constitution, and I started my analysis with that because that Constitution provided for a series of rights, individual rights, very similar to the U.S. Constitution. It wasn't as broad as the U.S. Constitution, but it did provide for a series of basic rights like we have in the Bill of Rights of our Constitution. It provided the right to vote. It provided freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, and other individual rights. It recognized private property and other property rights. It banned discrimination of gender, race, ethnic origin, or class. And, very interesting, it created the presumption of innocence in judicial proceedings, something that it did not have before. So, from a modern perspective, the 1940 Constitution was a pretty modern Constitution, and it was similar, not identical, but similar to the U.S. Constitution. And it gave its citizens a series of basic rights that the government followed in most cases. Now, while that Constitution was actually valid and in place in 1959, after the revolution, the revolutionary government did not enforce that Constitution, didn't follow it. So Cuba went from 1959 to 1975, 16 years without a constitution. The government did whatever it wanted. It completely ignored the rights of the people under the 1940 Constitution. Did not even pass its own constitution. Just didn't even have one. So in 1976, the Cuban government, or the revolutionary government, created its first constitution. And that constitution was modeled after the 1936 Soviet Constitution. It called for centralized control of the market. The government controlled the market. Recommitted the state to providing its citizens with access to free education and health care, as in the 1940 Constitution. That was already there. It gave citizens, believe it or not, freedom of speech. That was in Article 53. Article 54 gave citizens the right to assemble. Article 38 required parents to educate their children in Marxist ideals in order to contribute to a socialist society. That is an unbelievable requirement that was imposed by the revolutionary government on the Cuban people, to educate their children in Marxist ideology so that they could participate in a socialist society. In 2002, the revolutionary government doubled down on its constitution and passed an amendment to the 1976 Constitution that stipulated, that the socialistic system was permanent and irrevocable. By 2002, the Cuban government knew very well that their socialist system, economic or political, wasn't working. The people were starving. And yet they doubled down on the socialist ideal or the socialist constitutional, economic and political aspects of the 1976 Constitution. What happened? And again, I had not looked at the 2019 Constitution, even though I had been involved in the Elian case, in 2001, 2002. The 2019 Constitution was not in existence, so I only was familiar with the 1976 Constitution. In 2018, the Cuban government, or the Cuban Communist Party, or a Cuban Communist Party task force, was instructed to draft a new constitution. And the idea was to reform and modernize the Cuban government. That was the idea. In reality, what it was a propaganda, public relations campaign to show the world that on paper, Cuba was no different than any Western democracy because of the rights that it included in its new constitution. So, what did it do? The 2018 draft that became the 2019 Cuban Constitution increased, they added 92 articles. It increased the total from 137 from the 1976 Constitution to 229 articles, most of them dealing with individual rights. It was a radical, and it is a radical departure from the 1976 Constitution, because the 2019 Constitution recognizes private property, acknowledges climate change and its threat. It creates term limits for the president. It legalizes same-sex marriage. It bans discrimination based on gender, race, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. And, believe it or not, it restores the presumption of innocence in the justice system that was last provided in the 1940 Constitution. So what did they do? They resorted back to the 1940 Constitution, expanded the individual rights, but on paper. And a country can put whatever it wants on paper. If the government does not enforce those rights, if it does not protect those rights, if it doesn't make sure that all government agencies enforce those rights, the rights mean nothing. And we know that because in July of 2021, these rights, and we're going to go through them because I have them in my presentation, the right to peacefully assembly, okay, peaceful assembly. We know that in July of 2021, when the people in Cuba were protesting, the government cracked down on them, and they were not violent protests. They were people just walking down the street asking for patria y vida, country and life, freedom. That's all they were asking for. And we know what the Cuban government did, the repression that it imposed. We are seeing reports on a constant basis of protesters receiving 5, 10, 15, and 20 years of prison simply for complaining and expressing their constitutional right to protest and assemble. So when we go through the, quote, rights in the 2019 Constitution, on paper they look beautiful. They're wonderful. They are incredibly protective of human individual rights, but they mean nothing. What are the basic rights? Go to page 5, please. Right. What we know from reviewing our own Constitution here in the United States and reviewing some of the Western democratic countries' constitutions is that they're all very similar to a degree. They have similar or almost identical series of individual rights. And while the justice systems may be a little different, they incorporate the same basic rights that we have in the United States. So, if we were to build a constitution, what rights would we want as Cubans or as Americans or as whoever in our constitution? Well, the roadmap is very easy to follow. The U.S. Constitution has those rights laid out. Religion. The government shall not make any law respecting an establishment of a particular religion. You believe what you want to believe. If you want to be a Buddhist, be a Buddhist. If you want to be a Catholic, be a Catholic. If you want to be a Jew, be a Jew. But the government cannot interfere in establishing a state-sponsored religion. Free speech. A government shall not prohibit the exercise of speech or the abridging the freedom of speech. Now, does that mean that you can go into a movie theater and yell fire? No, that's not freedom of speech. That's a crime. But the right to protest, the right to criticize a president or a vice president or a senator or a governor, that is your right under our Constitution. And as long as you're not making threats, or as long as you're not creating the situation of a riot or doing something illegal, the government cannot interfere with your right to express your opinion and express your beliefs and express your right to protest what you don't agree with. Freedom of the press. The government shall make no law abridging or prohibiting the press. Now today, that has come under attack. No matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, we know that, quote unquote, the press doesn't always report the facts. The press has an agenda, a narrative that they put out because they got to sell their newspapers or they got to sell their shows or whatever. Whether you agree or disagree, the right of them to be able to do that is what is protected in our Constitution. And that right is incredibly important in a free and democratic Cuba. Agree with the position or not, that's not the point. The point is that the press must have the right to print whatever they want to print, Because once you begin censoring, where does it stop? Who censors the censors? So that's why these rights that we're going over are actually in our Constitution. Freedom of association. The government shall not prohibit or abridge the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Wow. People have the right to complain. People have the right to be part of an organization like this or any other organization that they want to belong to, within certain limits. The law does not protect you if you want to join a terrorist organization and commit acts of terrorism and crimes against the population. No, that doesn't protect you there. But if you're peaceful, whether the government likes your opinions or not, the government cannot interfere with your right to assemble, to peacefully assemble and complain about what you don't like. The next right is unique to the United States. The right to keep and bear arms. A government shall not infringe the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Many Western democracies do not have that in their constitutions. And what was the product of that? Why was that in our Constitution? Well, number one, in the 1700s, the colonies were expanding westward. They were dealing with Native Americans who were fighting back with white men taking over their territories. We were also under the influence and under the control of the British government, who felt that as colonists, our forefathers didn't have any rights. And so the framers of the Constitution wanted to do two things. Number one, they wanted to make sure that the people had a right to keep and bear arms. And secondly, and more importantly, they wanted to give the people the right to have a militia. Remember, this Constitution was written after there was a Continental Army created that won the Revolutionary War. So they wanted to make sure that the colonies had militias available to support the Continental Army. And you know what that is called today? The National Guard. The National Guard of every state is really the evolution of the colonial militias that fought during the Revolutionary War in the United States. At that time, they were colonies. They were not states. So what we have today is our National Guard, which is a militia. They can be called out in an emergency to support the Army or the Navy or the Marines or any other military branch if need be. And they have been. Quartering of soldiers, very interesting right. The government shall not, in time of peace or war, quarter in any house a soldier without the consent of the owner. Means the government can't put a soldier in your house unless you give your consent. Where did that come from? Well, the British government, before the Revolutionary War, would quarter their soldiers in the houses of the colonists. And the colonists had to take care of those soldiers, feed them, help mend their clothes, wash their clothes, and it was no cost to the British government. So the forefathers said, we're not having that. We're not having military personnel inside a citizen's home unless that citizen consents to that event. Unreasonable searches and seizures. A government shall not infringe the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Warrants shall only be issued based on probable cause and must be supported by oath or affirmation with particular description of the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The British government would come into a colonist home without a court order, without any probable cause, search, especially during the beginning of the Revolutionary War, where everybody was, the revolutionary colonists were hiding and were keeping secret, and they basically had two faces. They had their daily face that they would project to the people as law-abiding lawyers and doctors, and then they would have the revolutionary face that they were trying to organize and overthrow the British government. So the British government would walk in, they could search a house with no documents, with no court orders, and the forefathers said, enough. We're not allowing that. And so that aspect of the Fourth Amendment is what we see today. But it's because of that all these rights and their experience with the British government is how they got placed into our Constitution. Being formally charged, and the right to be informed of the charges, what we call the due process rights of the Fifth Amendment, the right to a notice, the right to an opportunity to be heard, the right to a trial by jury. All these rights were the product of great men who analyzed the British system, judicial system, and said, we can do better. We can create a system of justice that is going to be much more fair and much more democratic. For example, the presumption of innocence. Under British law, you're guilty, or we're guilty, until proven innocent. And our forefathers completely changed that. Now, you're innocent until proven guilty. It's the government's responsibility to prove you guilty. It is not your proof, it is not your burden to prove yourself innocent. And they saw that 250 years ago, which is a pretty amazing legal development from a theory standpoint when you think about it. It was a novel idea. It is now accepted pretty much throughout every Western democracy. You can't be a witness against yourself. Fifth Amendment protection. A government shall not compel a person to be a witness against himself. Double jeopardy. A government shall not subject a person to trial more than once for the same offense. Now, that's a problem with our Constitution. It's a flaw in our Constitution, and let me explain why. That provision in our Constitution has been interpreted to mean that only you cannot be brought to trial by the same sovereign twice. But we have 51 sovereigns in the United States. The federal government is one sovereign, and every state is a sovereign. So this provision, as recently as 2 years ago, was interpreted by the United States Supreme Court. They were asked to change the law and say that you could only be brought to trial once, regardless of whether it was the federal government bringing you to trial or the state government bringing you to trial. They argued that we should change that interpretation and change the precedent that has been in place for over 200 years. The Supreme Court said no. So you can be brought to trial twice, as long as it's different sovereigns. The award that, Ariel, are you on page 6 by any chance? Okay, good. The award that Ariel was mentioning that I received, actually I got it on Saturday, actually was an award where I represented a woman over 6 years in 3 cases. She was first charged in state court, and I convinced the judge to give her a very, very light sentence. And the case was investigated by both federal agents and state agents. But the federal agents were the ones that were controlling the case. Well, they got very upset because I had done such a good job, and I had convinced this judge. They were asking for a 10-year sentence. The judge gave her a 1-year sentence, so they were very upset. So what did they do? They waited for her to finish her sentence and then ran to federal court and asked the federal prosecutor to indict her, charge her again with the same crimes that she had been in charge in state court. I wrote to the prosecutor and I said, hey, you're charging her with the same thing that she was charged in state court. I showed him the proof. He knew it, but he pretended like he didn't know. And he said, I'll take a look at it and get back to you. And what did he do? He realized the legal problems that he was going to have, and then he indicted her again on another count, on another charge, regarding a pharmacy that was not on the papers of the original state case. I was able to convince the judge that what they had done was violate my client's due process rights because they knew that she was going to plead guilty in the state case, and they sat back and waited. And by waiting, they deprived her of her right to take the stand and defend herself in the federal cases where she did have a defense, because they took so long in indicting her. The judge agreed with me and dismissed both cases. But that is rare. In fact, it is almost impossible to win a motion to dismiss at the federal level because of the rules that are there. But that's what I got the award for. But again, there are exceptions even to our own rights in the Constitution. And Ariel mentioned earlier that I was a constitutional expert. I am not a constitutional expert, okay? Constitutional experts are constitutional scholars. I'm a constitutional practitioner. Whole different ballgame. Scholars present ideals on paper. Practitioners deal with the actual paper on a day-by-day basis. And I have been 40 years fighting to make sure that the government applies those rights, these rights that we are going over, in every case that I've handled. And people say to me sometimes, well, you know, how can you represent somebody who's guilty? It's my obligation, number one. Number two, I'm there to make sure that the government meets its burden under the law and not shortcut their proof, not present false evidence against my client. And if they do their job, they win. But when they don't do their job, they shouldn't win. Because we cannot expect anything less from a government than to comply with the rule of law. And the Constitution is the rule of law. So as a constitutional practitioner, I deal in almost every single one of these rights. Throughout 40 years, I've dealt with them all. And that's my job. Let's get back to property, eminent domain. The government shall not take private property for public use without just compensation. Our framers put that in there 1789. So, you know, this has been our right, our constitutional right, for almost 250 years. It was in the 1940 Cuban Constitution, and it's now back in the Constitution of 2019. Does the government respect that? Absolutely not. The government of Cuba, I'm talking about, okay? We've had, by the way, speaking of this, We had some developments in the last 24 hours. I actually pulled the articles. Thought it was important to share with our viewers. It was in yesterday's Miami Herald. In a first, U.S. government greenlights American investment in private business in Cuba. The government approved an investment of $25,000 by an American citizen to a business in Cuba. Now, personally, I think that investor is insane for investing anything in Cuba at this time, number one. We know as Cubans and anybody who reads, any information about Cuba, that the Cuban government can be very selective about taking somebody's property away. If they believe that that individual has any kind of antagonism toward the government, they create a charge of being an anti-revolutionary or some other charge which, doesn't even make any sense sometimes, spitting on the sidewalk or walking on the wrong side of the street, and they take away that individual's property. We know that Spanish citizens have lost hotels, people have lost homes, and I'm talking about foreigners, not necessarily Cuban Americans that are living in the United States or even Americans that are living in the United States. I'm talking about foreigners that went out and invested in Cuba. Going back to my old professor, the right to private property is the basis of a democracy. If the government cannot protect an individual's right to own property, then you cannot have a democracy. From an economic standpoint, from an investment standpoint, if you cannot be protective of investors' properties, whether the investor agrees with the government or not is irrelevant, your economy can never thrive. Because you cannot get an influx of money, investment, infrastructure, or any of the things that a country needs constantly to survive. There was another article where, and this was out on May 15th, where the Cuban government is pretending to the world that it allows for the people to provide a referendum. So they're going to have a referendum on marriage equality. They announced it in February. It's about to go to a vote. And even though their constitution supposedly provides for marriage equality, they're doing a referendum at this stage of the revolution. They're doing a referendum on marriage equality. And there is allegedly a disagreement or a fight amongst the Cuban people as to whether to pass that referendum or not, the church being opposed to it and the liberal left being in favor of it. So we'll see what that referendum shows. We'll see what the vote is. We'll see if it's actually a vote. But these are things that are happening right now in Cuba, which are very interesting for the future development of Cuba, both from a governmental, democratic side and from a judicial system side. Go to page 7. We also have the right to a speedy trial. Government can't keep you in jail forever. They must bring you to trial quickly. The right to be informed of the accusation. You have to know what you are being accused of. The right to confront witnesses. You know, witnesses cannot be in hiding and you don't know who they are or what they're going to say. We have the right to confront the witnesses, have them sit down and point their finger and say and accuse me of what I've done. The right to counsel. Trial by jury. Now, this is very interesting because the United States, this is another right that is unique to our system of justice. In England, there is a jury system, but it's a little different than our jury system. Our jury system, the jurors decide the facts, and they decide whether the government has met its burden of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's our highest level of proof in a criminal case. It's actually the highest level of proof in our system, but it only applies in criminal cases. And most people don't know how that is defined. And at the federal level, the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the definition goes like this. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof of such convincing character that you are willing to rely and act upon it without hesitation in the most important of your own affairs. It's a pretty high standard, right? Rely and act upon it without hesitation in the most important of your own affairs. Cuba does not have that standard today. Didn't have it. Didn't have it in 1940. Definitely didn't have it between 1959 and 1976, nor did it have it between 76 and 2019. So, Cuba never had a jury system. Most countries do not have jury systems. They have either a judge or a three-panel judge, or panel of three judges deciding the case. And the transformation, we saw this many years ago when Colombia was trying to reform its justice system. They wanted to go to an American-style type of system, but they didn't have the tools necessary to do it. Some of the Western democracies, the justice systems they did not have an independent judiciary. The judge was also the prosecutor. He investigated the case. They realized the problems with that, and they began to transform their justice system. So what did they do? Very intelligently, they brought teams of judges from the United States, teams of lawyers from the United States to train the judges, the prosecutor's office, because they created the prosecutor's office, and a public defender office. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but they began to reform their system in order to, because they realized that they must be independent agencies. They cannot be working on the same thing at the same time, and a judge cannot be investigating a case. A judge is like a referee. He decides the evidence, he decides the case, but he can't be investigating the case and at the same time deciding the case. Another thing which is very unique to the U.S. Constitution, the Eighth Amendment, excessive bail. It says the government shall not require excessive bail or excessive fines, nor shall it inflict cruel and unusual punishment. Most countries do not have that provision. Even in the Western democracies, they do not have that provision. They have, for example, limitations that you cannot execute. They do not have a death penalty. Okay? We are one of the few Western countries that have a death penalty. So there are differences between the Western democracies in the way that they have laid out their constitution. One of the things that is very interesting, the way our system of justice and our Constitution works, is that when they created the federal system, our constitutional system, they had a problem. How do we get, and they had a problem for years, how do we get the colonies to adopt these rights so that every colony has the same protections, or the people of each colony have the same protection? And these guys, these forefathers, were so smart that what they did was they created the 14th Amendment, which has in it a due process clause that says that all of the rights in the federal Constitution are applicable to the states through the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. So that required every state, or at the time every colony, that signed off on the Constitution and adopted the Constitution, that they would abide by the rights in the drafted Constitution as to their individual colonies. Pretty interesting way of getting the different colonies to agree to protect the rights of the people that were in the Constitution. One very, very important thing about our Constitution, and that is, and it is important for us, it is a major problem for Cuba, and that is that our Constitution requires the military to answer to civilian authority. Does anybody know why we haven't had a coup in the United States in over 250 years? One of the reasons is that the Constitution requires, and every oath of every military person swears that he will serve and protect the enemies of the United States, both foreign and domestic. It would be a violation of their oath to try to replace civilian authority. And I'll share a story with you to show you how far back this goes. And this has been documented. It's not something that is popularized, but it is true. After the British surrendered in Yorktown, General Washington was obviously victorious. He had his troops, he had his army, and he sat down with his officers after the surrender and posed the question, all right, what do we do next? Where do we go from here? And many of his officers said, General, right now we've just defeated one of the greatest armies in the world. Let's march on the capital and take over the capital, which at that time was in Philadelphia. And the story goes that General Washington turned to those officers and said, if we do that, everything that we have fought for will be destroyed. We are not here to run anything. We are the Continental Army. We are under the control of the civilian authorities, and whatever the civilian authority wants to do with this army, they will do, and we will follow. And any man that does not follow that will be charged with treason. Imagine the importance of that statement of the most powerful man at that time in the United States that could have taken that army and marched right into the Capitol and controlled and become king or dictator or whatever you want to call it, okay? Yet he had the foresight to realize that that would be the biggest mistake that he could make and that his officers would make, because it would destroy the concept of the revolution and the victory of and what they were fighting for. Do you all want to take a 5-minute break? Because I've been talking for an hour. You're tired of me talking? We can do a 5-minute break. How's that? Okay. Huh? Can we do a 5-minute break? Or do you want me to continue? No, I'm good. I can continue. I don't have a problem. I just thought that you guys may need a break from me for 5 minutes. All right. All right, let's take a look. Go to page 9. One more. You got to put your glasses on. There we go. All right. So let's take a look at the current Cuban Constitution. This is the 2019 Constitution. Okay. You guys, I'm telling you, you're going to start laughing when I read this to you. Okay? Because I started laughing when I read it. Actually, I almost started crying, to be honest with you, but I had to laugh. Chapter 2, it's labeled Rights. Article 46, all citizens have the right to life, physical and moral integrity, justice, security, peace, health, education, culture, recreation, sports, and to their holistic development. What is that? You know, where did they come up with this? Somebody had the U.S. Constitution sitting next to them as they were writing this stuff, okay? Article 47, the people have the right to the free development of their personality and must conduct themselves with respect, fraternity, and solidarity. I don't know what that means. Who decides what is respect? Who decides what is fraternity? And who decides what is solidarity? Solidarity with who? With the government? All the people have, this is Article 48, all the people have the right to personal and familiar privacy, to their own image and voice, their honor and their personal identity. Really? So why are all the bloggers in jail? Because that's part of their identity, that's part of their image, that's part of their voice. Why are they getting put in jail? Article 49. You're going to love this one. The home is an inviolable space. One may not enter in another dwelling without permission of the inhabitants except through a warrant issued by a competent authority following the legal formalities and for a motive previously defined by law. Seriously? I don't know of a single case where somebody was arrested in their home by the Cuban government where they have said that they were arrested pursuant to a warrant. If anybody knows, please bring it to my attention, but there hasn't been a single report of anyone arrested in the last, I don't know how many years. Let's go back to 2019, since this Constitution came into play, where it was been reported that a judge issued a warrant for the arrest of that individual, and that the judge issued a warrant for the government authorities to enter a home to arrest an individual. Article 50. Correspondence and other forms of communication between persons are inviolable. Sounds to me like freedom of speech, right? I can write to whoever I want. Are emails communications? I think they are. Are text messages communications? Obviously they are. It's a communication. They may only be intercepted or registered through a warrant issued by a competent authority in the cases and with the formalities established by the law. Documents of information obtained in violation of this principle do not constitute evidence within any legal proceeding. Really? Sounds to me like this is our Fourth Amendment interpreted by the Cuban government. And we know that this is hogwash, okay? People's phones get seized all the time. They get the evidence from the phones, they record the phone calls, and they violate their own constitution. We know that. Article 51, go to page 10. You there? Okay. People, Article 51, people may not be subject to forced disappearance. You're going to love this. Forced disappearance, torture, or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. That's in their Constitution. What happens to every person that has been branded an anti-revolutionary and has been taken to jail? They all come out with the same stories. They were beaten, they were tortured, they were humiliated. We're not talking about one case out of 10. We're talking 10 out of 10. Article 52. People have the right to enter, remain in, travel through, and exit from the national territory or to change their residence or domicile without any limits other than those established by the law. We all know the hurdles that many Cubans go through to try to get out of Cuba through a third country, and the hurdles that the Cuban government imposes or places on those individuals, such as, oh, your child is military age. You can leave, but your kid stays. Or you can't all leave together. You got to leave 2 today, and we'll let you know when the other group can leave. We've all seen that. We've all experienced it. Okay, it's part of our exile memories. Article 53. All people have the right to request and receive information from the state that is true, objective, and timely, and to access, I have to laugh, and to access the information generated by organs of the state and its entities according to the established regulations. I guess that's a form of freedom of the press, Cuban style. Article 54, the state recognizes, respects, and guarantees people freedom of thought, conscience, and expression. Conscientious objection may not be invoked with the intention of evading compliance with the law or impeding another from the exercise of their rights. That is so vague that it is subject to a multiple number of interpretations. Conscientious objection may not be invoked with the intention of evading compliance with the law or impeding another from the exercise of their rights. Does that mean that if I object to a Marxist socialist government and I express myself, I'm interfering with somebody else who believes in a Marxist socialist government? And can I be put in jail for violating this article? Article 55. You're going to love this one. People's freedom of press is recognized. Freedom of the press is recognized under the 2019 Cuban Constitution? Seriously? The right is exercised according to the law and for the good of society. Wait, either there's freedom of the press or there isn't freedom of the press. Who determines what is the good of society? Does the individual determine what is the good for society, or does the government determine for you what is the good of society? Because in the United States, freedom of the press is, press, you print whatever you want. It's up to each individual to believe, not believe, agree, not agree with whatever you write. The fundamental means of social communication in any of their forms, you're going to love this. The fundamental means of social communications in any of their forms are the socialist property of all people or of political, social, and mass organizations, and may not be categorized as any other type of property. It means the state owns everything. All forms of communication. The state establishes the principles of organization and operation for all means of social communication. How is that interpreted? Are they talking about Twitter or Facebook, or what about person-to-person social communication? So it's so vague that it is subject to whatever interpretation the government wants to give it. That's number one. Number two, the state shouldn't have a property right to any form of communication, whether it's personal or social, social communication or any other form of communication. Those are individual rights, not the state's rights. Article 56. They should have explained this to the protesters in July. The rights of assembly, demonstration, and association for legal and peaceful purposes are recognized by the state whenever they are exercised with respect to public order and in compliance with the precepts established by the law. So we're going to give you the right, but then we're going to pass a law to say you cannot assemble and you cannot protest. But for the world, somebody who doesn't understand, this looks like it is a very modern, Western-style, democratic constitution, and it is not. Article 57, go to page 11. Any person has the right to profess or not profess their religious beliefs, to change them, and to practice the religion of their choice with the required respect to other beliefs and in accordance with the law. Now, one area that Cuba has gotten somewhat better is to allow the practice of religion to a degree. To a degree. I know there is at least one organization, a Catholic organization, that has been doing retreats in Cuba, Emmaus retreats in Cuba, and the government has pretty much allowed them to do it. They've been doing it for several years. We have funded some of those retreats, my partner and I, and I believe that that will go a long way in changing the mentality of the people in Cuba from a religious Judeo-Christian perspective. Article 58. All people have the right to enjoy their personal property. Really? I wasn't aware that you could have personal property in Cuba without the government's consent. The state guarantees its use, enjoyment, and free disposal in accordance with what is established in law. The expropriation of goods is solely authorized for the purpose of attending to reasons of public utility or social interest with the required indemnity. Here we go. Eminent domain. What we have in our Constitution. The state cannot take your property without being compensated. I wish I could take a poll and find out how many people in Cuba who got their property taken away by the government were compensated for that. I guarantee you it is zero. The law establishes the means to determine their utility and necessity, the required guarantees, and the procedure for their expropriation and the form of indemnity. Number 59. Confiscation of property may only be applied as a sanction issued by a competent authority in the cases and through the procedures determined by the law. When the confiscation of property is ordered in an administrative procedure, a person is always guaranteed the ability to defend their right before the competent courts. It is ridiculous that this is in their Constitution and the government doesn't follow any of this stuff. You know, what person gets their property confiscated and has the ability to defend that confiscation before the Cuban courts? Article 60. Within its penitentiary policy, the state favors the social reintegration of persons deprived of liberty, guarantees the respect for their rights and the compliance with the norms established for their treatment within prison establishments. Really? Why are we getting stories constantly from people incarcerated in Cuba, political prisoners, where they have been tortured and again, humiliated, repressed inside the prisons, if this is a constitutional right? Likewise, it is responsible for the assistance and social reintegration of persons who fulfill their criminal penalties or comply with other measures imposed by the courts. Article 61. People have the right to direct complaints and petition to the authorities, who are obligated to process and respond to them in a timely and pertinent manner that is based on the term and procedure established by law. There are probably another 20 or 30 more articles in the Cuban Constitution that set out even more rights. Okay, I'm not going to go through them all, but they are there. If you want a copy of these materials, I'm sure that Dr. Bustamante will make them available to anybody that wants a copy of this. But I'm going to go through just some more of them, just so you get an idea of how Cuba modernized its constitution, but doesn't follow it. All people have the right. You're going to love this one. This one is directly for the Cuban doctors. All people have the right for their work to be remunerated according to its quality and quantity, which expresses the socialist principle of distribution from each according to their ability, to each according to their labor. All right. So a doctor who gets sent over to another country under a contract where the country's paying Cuba $30,000 or $40,000 per doctor, that doctor gets paid $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, and the Cuban government gets the other 90%. Is that according to their labor? Correct. They, as one of our distinguished board members just said, they keep the dollars, they get paid in dollars, and pay the doctors in pesos, Cuban pesos. They guarantee the right of children, and they prohibit child labor. They give workers' rights according to this Constitution, okay? The right to a break, to an 8-hour workday, a weekly break. You're going to love this. Annual paid vacations. Annual paid vacations. They have the right to Social Security and get a monthly stipend from retirement. We know that the people of Cuba are starving. They even with a government stipend, they still can't buy enough food to meet their weekly or monthly needs. Not just on food, but on personal hygiene items. We've known that for years. because we've sent families those items. We've sent them money to be able to buy food over the course of the last 60 years. So this is nothing, this is all garbage, okay, what they put into this Constitution. I mean, it's not garbage. The rights are important. The government just simply chooses not to enforce these rights or follow them. So it's a series of rights. I want to go back into history a little bit. Ariel, go to page 16. Our development or our evolution of our Constitution was, like I said earlier, was not the result of a 1 week, a 1 month, or 2 or 3 meeting with the delegates from each of the colonies, and they, boom, came up with the Constitution. That's not what happened. If you look at the history of how that Constitution came into play, it took 13 years of peaceful coexistence, dialogue, discussions, meetings, and a series of documents that were actually signed before they were able to come up with the Constitution. In 1976, the first document was the Declaration of Independence. All 13 colonies signed it. They wanted to get rid of the British. They wanted to be free. They wanted to have their own system of government, our own system of justice. And so that was the first event. The second event, after the Revolutionary War was over, 2 years after the Revolutionary War was over, 1781, the Articles of Confederation were ratified and served as America's first Constitution. The document gave the Confederation Congress the power to make rules and request funds from the states, but it had no enforcement powers, could not regulate commerce, and could not print money. So the first Confederate Congress was very, very limited in its powers. Then we went into 1787. The Constitutional Convention took place for more than 3 months. We're talking 6 years later. So we were, with the Articles of Confederation, in place as our Constitution for 6 years. The Constitutional Convention takes place in 1787, and it lasted more than 3 months. The colonies, that were still colonies at that time, apart from Rhode Island, through their legislature, collectively appointed 74 individuals. But only 55 delegates were in attendance. The number of delegates sent from each state was proportional to the state's population, meaning smaller states sent less number of delegates. 1788, New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. So we go from the actual drafting of the Constitution in 1787, providing that document to each of the states. In 1788, New Hampshire is the 9th state to ratify the Constitution. And then in 1789, the Constitution is officially implemented and the first federal elections are held. In 1791, 3/4 of the states ratified 10 of the 12 First Amendments sent to them. The first 10 are what we know as our Bill of Rights. So you see the process, you see the evolution that our forefathers, who were very learned men because they were all either lawyers or doctors or engineers, just the cream of the crop, were the ones that designed our Constitution. So what did the Constitution provide? Well, very simply, provided for 3 branches of government. The 3 branches would be independent from each other. The 3 branches would have different roles. The executive branch, presidency, was responsible for executing the laws. implementing the laws. The legislative branch was responsible for making the laws, and the judicial branch was responsible for deciding whether the laws were in line with the Constitution and whether the executive branch was following the Constitution. The independence of a judiciary is vital to any democracy. We must have 3 or 4 players in a judicial system for it to work. We need judges that must be independent. We must have a prosecutorial office that acts independent. We must have a public defender's office to represent the poor and the indigent. We must have, which is very, very important and often overlooked, we must have a clerk's office that can assure that the documents that are filed in court are in fact filed in court and valid and secures the authenticity of the court records. And we must have a private defense bar or a private attorney bar that is regulated independent of the court system, but in addition to the court system. As lawyers, I am governed not just by the rules of the Florida bar that I must follow, but I have rules of conduct from the courts, both state and federal, that I must follow. But again, these different branches act as checks and balances to each other and allows the government to work. If you have one branch that can in any way control or affect another branch of government, you do not have a true democracy. And you cannot have a true democracy. Go to page 18. I am almost finished. I just want to go through what my opinion is for a future judicial system of Cuba. But I want to talk so you could see the difference between the federal system and the state system. And Cuba may need a combination of both to an extent, in my opinion. The federal system, the judicial federal system, works very simply. Every federal judge, with the exception of United States magistrate, sit for life. They could sit as long as they want. There's no age limit. There's no term limit. There's nothing. The president will nominate, and the Senate will confirm. That's for United States District Court judges, for appellate judges, for the U.S. Supreme Court judges. And the way the federal system works is that within each state, there are federal districts. A combination of states make up an appellate division. So we have 11 circuit courts of appeal at the federal level. Every one of them has different states within it. All appeals go to that court. From there, they go to the Supreme Court. We have one Supreme Court. All the judges are appointed by life, to a life term. The magistrates are appointed for 7-year terms, and they are appointed by the chief judge of each district. So we're in the Southern District of Florida. The chief judge for us right now is Judge Cecilia Altonaga. She will get together with the judges of the district. She'll have candidates, and they will decide which is the magistrate that they are going to hire after a review process by a committee. And that magistrate will sit for 7 years. That's basically the federal system. The state system works a little different. The state system, the county and circuit court judges must run for election every 6 years. If there is a vacancy, the governor will appoint someone temporarily until that term, that judge's term, is set to expire, and then that person has to run for election if they want to, or anybody else can to file their petition to run against them and be a candidate. The appellate judges and the Supreme Court judges are appointed by the governor, but they must run for what we call merit retention every 6 years. That means that there is a way for the people of the state of Florida to remove an appellate court judge or a Supreme Court justice. If the majority of the voters within the state or in an appellate district vote to retain that judge, the judge stays for another 6 years. He doesn't have to run again for merit retention for another 6 years, and he's fine. If they vote to remove him or her, that judge must step down, and the governor will appoint another judge or someone else to fill that spot, who will then have to run for merit retention within 1 year of being appointed, and then every 6 years thereafter. So the state of Florida system is a little different than the federal system, but it gives the voters and the people of the state of Florida more control over what can happen to a judge. Okay? So now we get to Cuba. What do I foresee as a possible judicial system in Cuba in the course of its formulation? Well, Cuba only has 11 million people. It has 15 provinces plus a special municipality. Before the revolution, we had what, five provinces? 6 provinces. So if you go to page 19, you see the island, how it's divided. And you could very easily implement a system very similar to Florida, and it would work, because 15 provinces, you could have one Supreme Court in Havana, and you could have either 3 appellate courts, which would take on 5 provinces each, or you could have 5 appellate courts, which would take on 3 provinces each. It would reduce the work for the appellate court judges. You would implement a retention-style system, merit retention-style system. The judges at the Supreme Court level and the appellate court level could be appointed by the president of Cuba, the future president of Cuba, but they would have to undergo a merit retention vote every 6 years. The judges in the provinces, however, would be elected. And you would have what we have in Florida. You have a county court judge, which is a lower judge that handles only special types of cases. And then you would have a circuit court judge that would handle more serious cases. One set of laws for the entire country that would be implemented by these judges. If you needed to appeal, you would have the same system as Florida. A county court decision, you would have appeal it to the circuit court. A circuit court decision, you would appeal it to the appellate division or to the appellate court of that particular district that would cover 3 provinces or 5 provinces or whatever. Jury trials are going to be a problem. Implementing jury trials in a country that is not educated, and I don't mean educated in the sense that they're not smart. I'm talking about educated the way our forefathers were in the use of a jury system, is very difficult. Colombia has gone through that process and is going through that process still. They still haven't been able to accomplish that feat. So a jury trial system may not work in Cuba for many, many years until in other words, those of us that have gone to school here, how is the education process that we go through since elementary school about how our government works? How many times do you see your kids or grandkids telling you, oh, I'm doing a trial in school today. I'm going to be the prosecutor, or I'm going to be the defense lawyer, or I'm going to be the judge. So it is part of our education system to train people into respecting and understanding the seriousness of our obligations as jurors. And every once in a while, we get somebody that is corrupt, that sits on a jury, but that's minimal. That happens minimally across the United States. Okay? Overall, the jury system works pretty well for us. But it is something that has been evolving for 250 years. You're not going to get that kind of a result initially in Cuba, in my opinion. Eventually, could it happen? Yes, anything is possible. But initially, I believe the people of Cuba will be better served with competent judges at the trial level, at the appellate level, and at the Supreme Court level. And again, in Florida, whenever a justice retires, the governor that is in office at that time appoints a new justice. So you get a constant movement of judges over a certain number of years, which is great. It refreshes the panel. It refreshes the view of the Supreme Court. And judges, when they're sitting for a very, very long time, okay, in my opinion, they stagnate. Because it becomes the same thing, the tediousness. They lose what they had when they were practicing lawyers, which is the reality of what happens every day in courtrooms throughout the country. So I don't have a problem with a judge retiring or a judge or the citizens having the means by which to remove a judge. What I've never been in favor of, but I can understand why, and I see the benefit of it at the federal level for us, but it's always bad to give somebody a job for life. That's not always good. It's worked for us so far because of the way our training as lawyers has undergone over the centuries. And, you know, I've always believed, and I've said this before, we don't have Republican judges. We don't have Democratic judges. We have judges, period, who are 9 times out of 10 going to rule on the law based on the facts in front of them, based on the evidence in front of them, and whether a party likes it or not, that's the rule. Very rarely, when you look at all the decisions at the federal level throughout the country, very rarely have we seen decisions that are based on politics. Even though they publish it all the time, and, you know, and I hate when they do that. Oh, so-and-so was appointed by President Trump, or so-and-so was appointed by President Biden. You know, the more the press puts that out there, the more people will distrust the system. They're judges. Do they make mistakes? You better believe it. We're not perfect as lawyers, and judges aren't perfect either. Sometimes they have to rule in a way that the law is not crystal clear, and they will make a decision. That's why we have appellate courts. That's why we have the Supreme Court, to make sure that those decisions are correct. And even the Supreme Court has made mistakes. In 1896, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Nobody knows that case. You know the ruling of that case when I tell it to you, but nobody remembers that case by the name of the case. Plessy versus Ferguson was the case that the Supreme Court decided that separate facilities, as long as they were equal, were legal. So, black people had separate bathrooms, separate sections in restaurants, separate sections on buses. Do you know that that was the law of the land for 70 years? 70 years. People got arrested for violating that law. People that didn't agree with that law got arrested and prosecuted. And then the Supreme Court did an about-face in 1956, 56 or 54, and decided Brown versus Board of Education. and said separate but equal is inherently unequal, and did away with that decision. And so we began the quote-unquote civil rights movement to make things a little bit more fair for everybody, okay? So the Supreme Court is not infallible. They make mistakes. And sometimes, it takes years, okay, for them to revisit and say, you know what, we blew it, we made a mistake. But it is our system. It has worked for 250 years. As my father would say when I was a kid, because I've always wanted to be a lawyer, he goes, and I'll say it in Spanish, este no es necesariamente el mejor país del mundo, pero definitivamente es el menos malo. This country may not be the greatest country in the world, but it's the least bad one that we know of. So, again, our system may not be the perfect system, okay? But it works. And it works because the people in the system, the government, the prosecutors, the defense lawyers, the legislators, abide by the rule of law. And as long as you have that, and you have those rights in a constitution, everything will be fine. Everything works. To a degree it works, and it works pretty good. So I want to thank you. I hope that you enjoyed my talk. If there's anybody have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Well, why don't we give you a microphone so that everybody can hear you?
How do you see, or you foresee the stage of transition in Cuba when there is no judicial system?
How do I see what?
How it is going to function, the process of transition with the judicial system when there's no judicial system?
Well,
because
I think
I
the
have
question-
read and wondered.
No, I understand
how
the question.
They did it in Eastern Europe.
I understand the
Those
question.
countries had the same problem. I guess that's the most difficult.
I think that the first thing that needs to happen, believe it or not, is before we even get into a reconstruction or one of the problems that Cuba has is that the military controls everything. The military is really the benefit or the benefactors, okay, or the beneficiaries rather, of the money that is being made at all levels in Cuba, whether it's tourism, trade, or whatever. So you have the military not acting as the, quote, agency for national defense. You have the military acting as the beneficiaries, okay, and the profiteers or profiteers of what is happening in Cuba. So you do not have a separation of powers there, okay? You have the military controlling everything. Until the military stops being in control of everything, it will be very difficult to see any change in Cuba, in my opinion. We could have every single member of the original Castro revolutionary group, and I'm talking about Raul, I'm talking about all the generals and all the colonels, they could all die tomorrow. And as long as the military is making money and is in charge of every single agency that is profiting from Cuban cigars, the trade, tourism, you won't see a change. The military has to give up that power, okay, or that profit, and allow themselves to return to what it is that a military is supposed to do, which is protect the national security of a country. Period. End of story. So that's factor number one. Factor number two, there has to be a period of training for a judicial system. You know, Cuba has law schools. I know lawyers in Cuba, okay? But again, what are we teaching those lawyers? Okay? you also have to start from, elementary school. You've got to teach children the form of government, the procedure, to respect the rule of law, to understand how government works, all these things, so that when they get older and become adults, they have at least an understanding of what it is that needs to get done. And very important, one of the reasons why we do not have military coups in the United States is because, I don't know if you're aware of this, my family's all military, is in order for you, and this is any branch of military in the United States, in order for you to be raised in rank, one of the requirements is an educational requirement. You must have a degree, okay? So we implemented a system whereby, and by the way, every federal agency has a retirement age of 57. I don't know if anybody knew that. Whether you're a law enforcement agent, whether you're military, you retire mandatory at 57 unless we're in war, and they give you a special permission for you to continue on until that job is complete, until your assignment is complete. But so when any military officer retires, they are set up to be successful in the civilian sector, in the private sector. So they make more money in the private sector than they were making in the military, with their training, with their degrees. They all have PhDs, okay? And so they remove these individuals from the unemployment line to the employment line after military. And for the non-commissioned officers and the infantry, or not infantry, but the soldiers, they have a education plan that the Army pays for, depending on how many